Well, hello, good morning. We have a very, very special session that we're about to enter. I should say, almost by way of apology, that I didn't expect as one of the Jewish conference conveners to be responsible for moderating this important session for Christians. But as you know, Christianity is, as the senator said last night, Christian values, the Christian political inheritance and framework of America is important not only to Christians, it's important to Bible-believing people, it's important to moral and decent people of all persuasions. And that's the reason that NatCon takes a very strong interest in questions like, is there going to be fitting, suitable Protestant leadership in America? And I'm not saying that we don't need Catholic leaders or Jewish leaders or leaders of any other religious orientation. We need great leaders in all of them. But I think given the history of America, given what America has been since its founding, I think it's difficult to imagine a restoration, a moral, political restoration of this country, a spiritual restoration, without Protestant leadership. Right? And one of the difficult aspects of the conservative movement for decades has been that there's an abundance of excellent Catholic leaders, and there's often some very good Jewish leaders, sometimes excellent ones, but the Protestant piece, without which success is impossible, frequently seems like it's not quite there. Today, to discuss this and related topics, we have two of the truly great Protestant leaders of our generation. We're going to be first hearing from them and then have a moderated discussion. Dr. Albert Mohler, the great leader of the Southern Baptist Convention and president of the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary in Louisville, Kentucky, and Pastor Doug Wilson, who leads this remarkable Reformed, which I'm told I'm allowed to say Presbyterian as well, Reformed church in Moscow, Idaho. He has a college there that he's helped establish, New St. Andrew's College, and we're absolutely honored to be addressed by each of them in turn, and then to be able to listen in on the conversation between these two towering spiritual leaders. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Albert Mohler and Pastor Doug Wilson.
Well, thank you. It is an honor to be here at NatCon 24, and we all know that we are meeting at an urgent moment, and the urgency has been made clear by some events just even over the last couple of years that have been very sobering. When last I had the opportunity to address this movement in late 2022, I spoke on the impossibility of a secular state. What I want to speak about today is the impotence of a secular conservatism. And I don't mean thereby to divide the room, but rather to speak honestly about where I think we are and what I think we should be thinking. I do speak as a Christian. I do speak as a theologian. I speak, I think, with a great deal of common concern and common cause among all of us here. So I appreciate the invitation, and I want to say that the bomb that is in the background of my consideration, just to see a part of it, would be the Dobbs decision and the aftermath. I have been a part of the pro-life movement my entire adult life. I've had the privilege of being in rooms where major decisions have been made, strategies have been laid, and where facts and analytics have been considered. And I can tell you that there are those, and were those, who were quite convinced that this is an argument we were winning, that we were winning it self-evidently, that we were not winning it evenly, but the confidence was that if indeed all those years of work in conservative argument and conservative organizing and in what became a conservative legal recovery, a constitutional recovery, if that led to a reversal of Roe v. Wade, we would be ready for it. And we would discover a pent-up pro-life conviction on the part of the American people, certainly in key states painted red, where we would see pro-life conviction translated into pro-life legislation. And of course, what we've seen is exactly the opposite, beginning in Kansas, but also in my own Kentucky, where all of a sudden the bomb went off just announcing to us that whatever commitment there was to the pro-life cause, to the sanctity of human life, to the life of the unborn, it was much less ontological than we had thought. It was much less convictional than we had thought. And that leads me to the consideration for today. To be conservative is to hold allegiance to certain fixed truths and principles. Now, I'm old enough to remember in my own adult lifetime the argument that that basically means a conservative temperament and a conservative commitment to timeless tradition. The problem, I want to argue, is that the tradition without a fundamental commitment to truth, and that truth being fundamentally transcendent and theological, will soon evaporate. I would take that further and insist on fixed religious truths as well as traditions. I would underline that these fixed religious truths are grounded in specific acts of divine revelation on which we are entirely dependent. 2 points of urgency I want to make. Number one, conservatism is not just another form of liberalism. And then secondly, conservatism is not just liberalism or progressivism arriving later on the schedule with greater respect for the costs and challenges of what is defined as inevitable social and moral progress. Now, cutting ahead, I believe the great challenge that now confronts conservatives, and I mean conservative Christians here as well, of course, but conservatives writ large in the United States, but I speak with particular relevance to religious conservatives and American evangelicals. The great challenge is understanding that any worldview that does not ground itself in divine revelation, in the moral character of the self-existent, omnipotent, omniscient God, any conservative tradition that is not grounded in a prior commitment to ontology as well as tradition, it's going to evaporate. The only question is, will that happen quickly or more slowly? Now, one of the things we've seen in recent weeks, as a matter of fact, just in recent days, the collapse of the Conservative Party in Great Britain. I follow that party and that Anglo-American tradition very closely, and the argument I made in an article published immediately after the election is that we should not be surprised because the Conservative Party had abandoned conservatism. And I would point to an incident just, that's taken place now more than a decade ago when David Cameron, the British Prime Minister, head of the Tory party, just basically came out and suggested that the party abandon what had been a very long-standing commitment to social conservatism, and indeed even to the definition of marriage as the union of a man and a woman. And he said, I don't do this despite the fact I'm a conservative, but because I am a conservative. And at that point, it was just like the entire ontological structure of creation order was just denied by a party that calls itself conservative. I don't believe a party that does such a thing should expect not only a conservative reputation, but any confidence among those who know what is at stake. I'm not denying the importance of social traditions, morals, political principles, constitutional norms with you and with all conservatives. I want to emphasize how important that stewardship is. But I do want to argue that it all is a matter of constant negotiation and a process we are losing and are destined to lose unless the fixed traditions are grounded in revealed truth. Now, when you consider the challenges we face right now, it's impossible to say they are not ontological. We're living in a society that increasingly believes a boy can be a girl and a girl can be a boy. Now, just in terms of fundamental ontology, if we don't understand anything else, we would just understand that it has been assumed rightly throughout virtually all of human history that anatomy and ontology are definitive and determinative, and frankly, are not impositions but gifts. But we live in a time in which the progressive idea of personal autonomy has now reached the point that we are autonomous from ontology. I think it demonstrates the fact that when you have a conservative movement that is not itself committed to ontology, it's all just a matter of endless negotiation. The ontological grounding of the American order was made very clear in the Declaration of Independence and in other founding documents. When the founders spoke of nature and nature's God, when we are endowed by our Creator with certain inalienable rights, that's a language that is not just decorative. It is not just illustrative. That is hearkening back to what in the Lutheran tradition is referred to as creation order. And I'm glad to say behind that, the affirmation of what might rightly be called a natural law. The point is, it is a created order, it is a revealed order, and it is an order. Behind that order is the God of the Bible, the God of Genesis. Now, one of the interesting things is, of course, that would have been non-controversial at the time of the American founding. For one reason, the set of intellectual circumstances at the time was such that prior to Darwin, there was really no other explanation for why the world existed, why we exist. Historians, in particular, often refer to the early American period as that of a Protestant empire. The inheritance of Christendom, a very clear biblical worldview, and as I said, it really wasn't that there was another available worldview. You know, this is where Richard Dawkins' interesting statement was: it was impossible to be an intellectually fulfilled atheist until Darwin. And so you do see this great break in modernity and the arrival of a modern secular metaphysic and what was claimed to be at least a modern secular ontology. But it's an ontology that comes with absolutely nothing determinative. We hold these truths. We hold rights endowed by our Creator. It's based in a Christian ontology and morality, which is based upon Jewish antecedents in both general and special revelation. The secular experiment that is now underway and has been for some time is now seen in retrospect as that which is based upon actually nothing at all, nothing ontological, nothing in terms of reality, no particular metaphysic. You see this referenced now in open arguments that they are making, in which the left no longer shares any moral order, and even now it certainly rejects the ontology and the ontological commitments of the Christian tradition. You look at American history, the Protestant Empire, the Christian consensus, and we understand the rise of conservatism, which came as a response to the early cleavages in our society, and in particular, I think of the Wilsonian period and beyond in the 20th century. And then all of a sudden, there was this enormous appreciation among many conservative Americans for the work of someone like Edmund Burke. And there was, I would say, a half-hearted appropriation of Burke. The right half was in understanding the importance of the tradition and the binding authority of tradition. The unhelpful part was that many people did not bring with that what Burke clearly affirmed, and that is an ontological order behind that tradition, truth behind that tradition. You look in the United States and you understand that even much of what's been called conservative turns out to be either a conservatism, which is another form of liberalism, or conservatism is nothing but an attempt at a delayed fuse. And I would say you look back at previous Republican administrations and you understand that, you know, we can see that that's exactly the strategy that was undertaken. The post-Dobbs position now makes that very clear, even in conversations within the Republican Party. Behind all of this is also the Reagan Revolution, and behind that, we met Buckley, National Review, Fusionism. I'm not denying that Christian conservatives can have secular allies. I'm not denying that we can have vast areas of common agreement and common concern. But I am saying that at the end of the day, without an ontological commitment which is grounded in theological conviction, I don't believe there's any lasting conservatism to be found. It's because it has to be a commitment to truth, because it's going to be very costly. And it is because if this is not revealed truth to which we are accountable, in other words, if this is just another theory to be placed alongside competing theories, an argument to be placed alongside other arguments, if that's all there is to it, we are doomed. That is not what I believe is at the very core of our argument and at the core of our convictions. An impotent conservatism that is grounded in no ontology cannot sustain itself, cannot perpetuate itself, it cannot accomplish its stated aims, it cannot defend its most basic principles and postulates. Now, if you want to see evidence of that, just look at the collapse of Protestant liberalism, where you see, and just last year is the 100th anniversary of J. Gresham Machen's famous book, Christianity and Liberalism, in which he rightly said, we're not talking about two variants of Christianity, we're talking about two different religions. And as you look at that, you recognize nothing proves this point, sadly enough, as much as the tragedy of liberal Protestantism, which is just so accommodationist that it's become a cartoon of the age. What we see in the larger society is the collapse of conviction, the replacement of Christianity with a new religion. That's why we shouldn't be surprised by the rise of Marxism in all its different forms, critical theory. It is a reminder to us that when Adolf von Harnack, the German liberal, said what you need to do is separate the kernel and the husk of Christianity, you keep the kernel, which is religious experience basically, and you get rid of the husk, which is the claims of divine revelation, what you end up with is, well, the experiment of European decadence. A secular conservatism cannot meet the challenge of the day. And an accommodationist Christianity will do no better. A flimsy theism will disappear in the mists of modernity. In Robert Kagan's latest book, he makes the argument, liberalism is not inherently about progress, therefore, except the progress that comes from the expanding recognition of people's rights. It has no teleology, no final resting point toward which it aims. End of the quote. What an amazing statement. He admits there is no end game to liberalism. It is an endlessly open game with no teleology at all. There is no ultimate goal. It's the unfolding of inevitable Hegelian progress. And you look at that and you recognize the only answer to that cannot be anything short of ontology, and that ontology has to be grounded in theism. Cardinal Manning, an unusual person for an evangelical Christian Protestant to cite, said something profoundly true and nearly irreducible in terms of words. He said famously, all human conflict is ultimately theological. I want to end by saying this is exactly what it is. It is ultimately theological. There may be the claim that there's no theology here. Don't believe your eyes. But the reality is, all human conflict is ultimately theological. It is good to know what the alternatives are. It is good to know the challenge we face. It is good to speak honestly. We face the most insidious attacks upon human dignity and the sanctity of life, the goodness of marriage and family, the structures of human society, even the reality of good and evil, and the transcendent reality, the good, the beautiful, and the true. Our answer to that cannot be less than political. Our answer to that cannot be less than cultural. It cannot be less than strategic. And I also want to say it cannot be less than theological. And it is good that we acknowledge that fact. I speak as a Christian theologian. I do not want to confuse Christian theology with some vague idea of nationalism. I want to say that I do not believe this nation and all that it represents can survive abandoning its theological roots. Thank you for your time. May God bless America.
It's truly an honor to be here, so I'd like to thank the conference organizers for their gracious invitation. It is a privilege to interact with Dr. Mohler also, so I certainly thank him as well. And not to be tedious, I would also like to thank all of you out there, the audience, for you're the ones who are going to have to listen to this. We live in challenging times. The neo-pagans have returned to their ancient faith in the power of chaos and have been fomenting chaos so that, like a leftist Pecos Bill, they might ride their tornado into a utopian tomorrow, unburdened by what has been. To the point, whatever position National Review occupies currently in the constellation of conservative institutions, it should certainly have an honored place in the history of the Cold War. Theirs was a significant contribution in the struggle against communism, for which I am truly grateful. In response to the Soviet threat, and it was a threat, the late political philosopher Frank Meyer argued for what has been called fusionism, and under the leadership of William F. Buckley, a very effective anti-communist coalition was formed, made up of the free market guys, the social conservatives, and the anti-communist hawks. Now, as it happens, I'm a representative of all three of these positions and can report to you firsthand what the temperature levels need to be in order to bring about such a fusion. It requires at least 4 hours at 350 degrees Fahrenheit in a special kind of oven, that oven being a theological one, and preferably coming in Calvinist black. Anything less than that temperature or the wrong kind of oven, and there will be no true fusion, only confusion. This fusionist coalition worked very effectively against the Soviets. It culminated politically in the presidency of Ronald Reagan, alongside Margaret Thatcher serving as the UK Prime Minister. And so it was that the more doctrinaire commies were dispatched and good riddance, as we glibly assumed, for good. Driven out of Mirkwood, they reshaped elsewhere. Unfortunately, this fusionist approach turned out to be no good at all when it came to fighting the Gramscian commies. Their long march through the institutions was not even slowed down. In fact, I want to argue one of the root assumptions of fusionism served as miracle grow for these Gramscian weeds, successfully keeping the virtues and pieties of millions of American Christians privatized, or, as our adversaries would put it, sidelined and out of the way. It used to be that the sexually troubled had to keep their kinks hidden away in the closet. Now it is the conservative Christian who needs to keep his virtues hidden in the recesses of the closet, with some policing provided by conservative Christian fusionists. And so it is in a historically Christian country that millions of Christians are so deep in this assigned closet that they can see Narnia. And all of this is related to our topic under discussion, which is the relationship of private faith and public secularism. As Meyer saw it, the principal value in the public square ought to be the maintenance of liberty. And as our second president, John Adams, observed, a constitutionally ordered liberty presupposes a moral and a religious people. It is wholly unfit, he said, for any other. But in the fusionist approach, while Adams' claim was acknowledged and celebrated, that's important to note, acknowledged and celebrated, the hope was that this necessary piety or faith would fill in all the private spaces, church, home, prayer closet, and would provide the energy and uplift for all the work we would then do in public, that work being the maintenance of a very generic, non-sectarian, vanilla-safe liberty. You know, like how you show up for work full of pep and energy, but without having to reveal to anybody at the office what you had for breakfast at home, which was a private virtue energy bar. So in this approach, Christian virtue really was celebrated and acknowledged as essential. But all of this was to be located in the private sphere, with the idea that wonderful freedom-enhancing opportunities would continue to manifest in the public sphere. What this reveals is a radical misunderstanding of the nature of the relationship between private and public. If I may be so bold as to mix a metaphor right in front of you, there's no way to erect a firewall between the eggs and the omelet. I'll give you a moment to ponder that. That said, I would like to quote the words of someone who has been considered by many Christians to be something of a religious authority. He speaks, "Whosoever therefore shall be ashamed of me and my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, of him also shall the Son of Man be ashamed." Mark 8:38. There's no arbitrary division here between public and private, which means that for professing Christians, there's also no convenient place to hide. And for fusionism, this means, as the saying goes, no matter how thin you slice it, it is still baloney. Fusionism believes that virtue can only be an attribute of individuals. The state is responsible to protect freedom, the argument goes, but to leave the pursuit of virtue alone, delegating that to the individual level. But I do have questions. If the state focuses on the issues of liberty as it should, and notice that we need to use words like ought and should here, how is that not virtuous? And if it is virtuous, we must then ask what might be my favorite question, which is by what standard? If we are using a particular standard in praising the state for doing what it ought to do, like protecting liberty, how may we answer bright sophomores who press us on what that standard might be and what it might be based on? Moses? Jesus? John Stuart Mill? Or do we follow the example of our current president, just putting random things out there and then taking no questions? In short, what on earth do we mean by virtue? What is this thing that is so obvious in the lives of individuals, but which mysteriously becomes exceedingly coy as soon as a quorum of citizens assembles to decide something? You can consider this an intervention if you like. There's no getting away from it. Towns, villages, corporations, tribes, parties, states, and nations are all moral agents. We all know this because we routinely praise and blame them in moral terms. Our praise and blame are ethical. We are appealing to a standard that of necessity is a transcendent one. Whenever we do this, we are making, dare I say this, an appeal to heaven. Excuse me, is that phrase okay? I hear that. I hear there's been some trouble over it recently, and I'm not current with your sometimes hard to follow East Coast customs. Perhaps if we're supposed to keep virtue private, Samuel Alito's wife should have flown that particular flag on the flagpole of her heart. But here's the difficulty, and I'm afraid I'm going to press the point because this is the essential thing. Hearts don't have flagpoles, and public spaces do. And this is an inescapable concept because public flagpoles will always have flags on them. It is not whether you will have a flag, it is which flag you will have. If we will not have the appeal to heaven flag, then we are going to have the tranny flag, as can be readily seen. If the standard we appeal to is not transcendent, overarching all nations, and gloriously out of reach of every last parliament, court, or regulatory agency, then down here, we are all of us just the lost children of men. Statecraft turns into nothing but integration downward into the void. We could still have our conflict, sure, but moral indignation would be out whenever we mobilize for war. If states are not moral agents, then every war is nothing more than two dogs fighting over a piece of meat. Precisely because states are moral agents, it is possible to have good guys and bad guys. Bad guys can conduct unrighteous wars, break treaties, engage in ethnic cleansing and genocide, surveil all of your computer activity without a warrant, and of course, coming to the high treachery you are all no doubt anticipating I would address, make all our teens woke by means of chemtrails. Not only are we enabled to fight the bad guys, but we are also given the opportunity for repentance, which happens when we come to the horrifying realization that we have been the bad guys. Of course, I cannot resist the aside that if there's no moral standard at all, then there's nothing wrong with the inconsistency of getting all whipped up into a frenzied meringue of moral indignation. Knock yourself out. But insightful observers will still know that the whole show is nothing more than an arbitrary warp spasm. If there is no God with absolute moral authority over states and their collective moral choices, then anything goes, including the worst forms of absolutism. If there is no moral standard for mankind collectively considered, then we can have no complaint against arbitrary and capricious moralities being imposed on us in arbitrary and capricious ways. If there is no God above the lunatic state, then the lunatic state is God. And if there is no God over our collective neuroses, irrationalities, caprices, and flailing moralistic crusades, then all four of them are enthroned as God. And if liberty is the only thing that we care about in public, taking that one blessing and arbitrarily making it into the one thing needful for GDP reasons, then Jeremy Bentham is God. Now, it goes without saying that political authorities tend to take a dim view of this kind of line of thinking, refusing to render to Caesar that which has God's image on it. Remember that we, all of us, bear the image of God stamped in God's mint, meaning that we may not render ourselves to Caesar. Seems to them tinged with extremism. Political authorities really do not like the idea of the lordship of Jesus Christ being proclaimed in the public square, but they should have thought of that concern before they crucified him there. We live in a time when to express such sentiments as I've just been expressing them is tantamount to announcing that I would like to see if we could somehow renew the hostilities of the 30 Years' War. That would be just for starters, after which we could then move on to rebooting the Spanish Inquisition, and how about some fetching red dresses for all the handmaids? According to our updated Exodus story, for secularists, Europe was racked by religious wars and intolerant persecutions over the course of centuries until the arrival of Enlightenment Moses, who then led us into the promised land of secularism. Since that time, we've been gambling under the fluffy clouds of mutual forbearance, with no one ever being persecuted for their convictions. Unless, of course, they got in the way of progress, as hundreds of millions somehow did. And so here we are all now, suffocating under the preening self-congratulatory totalitarians. And when the entire body count of the Spanish Inquisition is more than matched by Planned Parenthood on a couple of slow afternoons. I've been using the word secularism, and so it's come time to make distinctions again. There is a historic use of secular, which can be appropriate and helpful. In this sense, no reasonable Christian should have trouble with keeping the public square secular, but we keep bumping up against the need for definitions. What do we mean by secular? May we use the word in its more traditional sense, as opposed to godless secularism, that legacy of the Warren Court? Secularism need not be understood as godlessness. I call this mere Christendom, or Christian nationalism, but you could even call it Christian secularism if you wanted to. In the medieval world, there were the regular clergy in the monasteries, governed by rule, regulus, and the secular clergy out in the parishes, dealing with ordinary folks and their day-to-day concerns. So there can be such a thing as Christian secularism, a secularism that does not need to be a pinched and narrow ecclesiocracy at all, as in Iran. No one needs rule by the weirbeards. So secular in this sense means non-ecclesiastical, not godless. But what we call secularism today is a pathological ideology that has banished the permanent things from public discourse in the name of neutrality. Their notion of neutrality, of course. We must be neutral about everything except, of course, the hegemonic authority of their approved forms of diseased godlessness. Such secularism cannot cohere as a realm at all, but rather becomes the disintegrating heap of self-willed antinomianism. And if you still require evidence that this is going on in our culture today, then let me be the first to congratulate you on your safe return from Mars. I've sometimes entertained myself with daydreams about a festive press conference with someone named something like Senator Silas T. Snoutworthy, a Republican from some Bible Belt state. It had been discovered during the campaign that he had grown up a Wisconsin Synod Lutheran, very conservative synod, and had been interrogated about this by inquisitorial reporters, probably Dominicans. But Silas knew the drill just as you do, and so he had replied deftly, "My faith, which is a very precious and private thing to me, will not have any influence over my votes or behavior if I'm privileged to represent the good people of my state." You've heard that said a number of times, I dare say. 6 months later, he was pulled over for a DUI. He was driving a red convertible with a couple of blonde hookers as passengers and with $10,000 worth of crack cocaine in the trunk. Now, this is the kind of thing that official Washington usually takes right in stride. But everything was thrown into disarray at the press conference on the following day. Snoutworthy was absolutely unapologetic. "My faith," he reiterated, "is a very precious and private thing to me, but I promised the people of my state that it would have absolutely no impact on my behavior while in Washington, and I'm a man who keeps my promises." To which some of our secularist opponents will mutter, "You know what we mean," and to which I reply, actually no. This is the central problem. We have no idea what you mean. You want an ethical world without ethical foundations. You want decent citizens without any way to define decency. You want to build the most moral society ever on the Big Rock Candy Mountain. You are fundamentalists with no fundament. When I talk this way, they accuse us of wanting to impose morality. But all laws are imposed morality, with the only question being which morality. All laws impose morality, and nothing but morality. But which one? The charge is false if by it they mean we think that good legislation can bring about heart regeneration, for of course it cannot. But it is possible and necessary to legislate morally, which is quite a different thing, and which requires a standard. Our difficulties in getting this point across may have something to do with an observation once made by Upton Sinclair. It is difficult to get a man to understand something when his salary depends on his not understanding it. When they first began moving the Overton window concerning these terms, they had sense enough to do it incrementally, an inch here and an inch there. And conservatives, hogtied by fusionism, went along with this, with the more conservative members grumbling about it. But then the crazy accelerated. When conservatives refer to the movement of the Overton window now, they are usually talking about the rapid changes of the last 5 to 10 years. You can now be charged with the hate crime of having a position on marriage identical to the one articulated by Obama in his run for the presidency and by Hillary in her run for it. That is quite a rapid movement. And so extremism is just moderation that doesn't move with the times. But the window has also moved slowly over the course of 75 years on this vexed issue of the meaning of secularism. There was a Supreme Court decision back in 1892, exquisitely named Holy Trinity versus the United States of America. I love Providence. In which Chief Justice Brewer wrote a majority opinion that determined that America was in fact a Christian nation and had been since the founding. Unlike some today, Brewer knew that Earl Warren was not one of the founders, because Warren had just been born the previous year in 1891. Brewer wrote cogently about the God of the Christian faith as our God and not some generic off-brand deity. But from then till now, we have seen a massive change. I make this next observation because, as I take it, I am addressing a conference filled with conservative activists. The Overton window must be moved back in the other direction, and it must be moved on this foundational issue of godless. All the cool kids would still think outrageous, and this affects the conservatives who still care what the cool kids think. Thankfully, that number appears to be diminishing. This is not a proposal that requires huge funding or getting bills passed or coalitions built. Nothing like that. It is more like what happened when the U.S. Embassy was moved from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. Somebody just did it. Or like a Mr. Gorbachev tear down this wall moment. Some of you are in a position to urge this very simple thing, and so I'd like to ask you to do so. Political theoreticians can sometimes get pretty heady, and so I would like to make a concrete proposal that would really mess with this very contrived division between private faith and public virtue. In Acts 12, 21 through 23, Herod Agrippa I, in the flush of a political triumph, received some overheated adulation from a crowd, and he did not give glory to God, which is why that story ended somewhat abruptly. We are in the middle of an overheated political situation ourselves, and so if Donald Trump is sworn in as our president again, it will be one of the most remarkable political comeback stories ever. If such a thing were to happen, my appeal to Donald Trump would be this: on Inauguration Day, as you love God, as you love your country, and as you love your own soul, give explicit glory to the God of heaven, and do it in the name of Jesus Christ, our Lord. Thank you.
Well, thank you both for two rousing and very fine speeches. It's my unfortunate duty to push back just a little bit. Not because I disagreed with the sentiments, but look, it seems to me, and probably to many other people if you're above a certain age, people today think back about, think about the Reagan era, the Reagan Revolution, it constantly discussed as though it was overwhelmingly about libertarianism or economic liberalism, economic freedom, and spreading that around the world. But those of us who are a little bit older, I think we remember it differently. The Reagan Revolution was based to a very, very great extent on fiery, forceful, Protestant public activism. I mean, I think it's simply unimaginable to think about Reagan being swept into office without thinking of that era of Billy Graham and Jerry Falwell and Pat Robertson. You can agree more or less with these different figures and many others, but it was a thickly Protestant moment, and the Protestants led in constructing an alliance with conservative Catholics and advancing the idea of a constitutional amendment to return prayer to the schools. what's our outlook? What's the prospect today for the return of some kind of an active, forceful Protestantism leading in America and therefore in the democratic world?
I would say that, and having kind of lived through that, as you did, for one thing, there was a more Protestant ethos in the United States of America in, say, 1980, the late 1970s, than what you see now. And so the New Christian Right, as it was called then, is always going to be called something. It was largely an awakening of Christians to a political emergency. And they were summoned to that emergency on the basis of very clear policy proposals, very clear political arguments. They didn't have a comprehensive political worldview behind that. They frankly didn't have a very long or extensive or elaborated strategy. And so I think you look back to that period, and I can remember being in those rooms at that time, there was the sense that we can win this thing, that there are enough of us, we can win this thing. I think we're in a situation now where we recognize we're going to have a much longer strategy, a much deeper argument, a much more comprehensive strategy. And so I think that the difficulty is that an awful lot of the people who filled those rooms with energy, they're needing leadership they're not getting from an awful lot of evangelical Christians and Protestants. And so I think what you see today is, again, evidence of the fact there are some Protestants who are trying to step up and say, look, here's the way we must go, and here's how we must think. These are the fountains from which we must draw water. And these are the principles and truths we're going to have to live by, and if necessary, die by. And so I do think it's a very different thing. I can tell you that I guess optimism is not the wrong word, of 1980 is replaced with something very, very different in 2024.
I agree with all that, and would add one thing that ties in with Dr. Mohler's talk, and that is among the people you mentioned, I would also want to add Francis Schaeffer. And what Francis Schaeffer did was he provided a theological undergirding, pointing to the ontology that you were talking about. The groups like the Moral Majority and the Christian Coalition were made up of many well-intentioned brothers. I call the Wahoo Brethren, Energy, People, Shock Troops, Man the Phone Banks, those kind of folks. But they needed direction, theological direction and substance. They needed to be more than all sail, no ballast. And what Schaeffer did was provided an infrastructure for some sort of intellectual coherence. He kept pointing to the Christian consensus of the founding of the country and was providing a reminder of that consensus. And that's one of the things that is lacking today. We still have millions of professing evangelical Christians who are faithfully attending church and doing, but they are in many ways on issues of politics and culture like sheep without a shepherd, because there is no coherent driving articulation of what it is we're supposed to be doing.
Well, I keep running into this. I mean, it's a little bit funny to think about this, but I get invited to reasonably frequently to Christian universities, and the question and answer period. You know, I speak from kind of an Old Testament perspective, and you know what's going on in this world and in this country, right before us in you know what you call the secular world. For Jews, I think it's very easy to look at that and say, well, God wants us to be involved. But as I travel around Christian colleges, I would say overwhelmingly the most common question that I get, there's no talk I give where I don't get at least one or two versions of the following question. Dr. Fazzoni, you want us to be active politically. You want us to go out and fight all these troubles that we see. But don't you think that, you know, I personally should really just focus a lot on my relationship with Jesus? That's what my pastor says.
No.
Well, a part of
this
tell me
is-
what's the answer I should be giving?
Well, the answer is that the model of the Christian, faithful Christian in the New Testament is not that. Not someone disengaged from the battle of the mind, the battle of ideologies, and for that matter, the responsibility to work for righteousness and justice, and again, the political context, very different. But, you look at this, you realize the biggest problem we have in many ways among evangelicals is that evangelicals, and I think this is true on the conservative side, writ large, and particularly where you find conservative religious folks, particularly conservative Roman Catholics, and conservative evangelicals, and conservative Jewish friends, here's what you find. They're raising their children. They're establishing families. They're active in the things of the Lord. Very, very, very busy. And so, they feel, what I sense is the greater potential to unfaithfulness is pulling away from those spheres, trying to put it in the context of a comprehensive whole, which, by the way, as a Christian, I want to say, it really does need ecclesia, it really does need the church to orchestrate. I think that's a huge problem. But yeah, there are a lot of people who think that their walk with Jesus is to be disengaged from the larger world, and that's just not New Testament Christianity.
Yes, because what it does is it sets up the greatest commandment, the Shema, Deuteronomy 6. You love the Lord your God with everything you've got. It sets it up as a competitor with the second greatest commandment from Leviticus, love your neighbor as yourself. But loving God and loving your neighbor are not competitors. John tells us in his epistles that we demonstrate that we love God by how we love our neighbor. And if you don't know how the clutch works between those two commandments, then you're going to be stymied when it comes to interacting with anything in the world. And I think, like you said, most evangelicals have it dialed in when it comes to family and immediate friends. They want their faith to translate into their families, and they want but it goes bigger than that. It has to go bigger.
When I think about the prospects of restoration, and I would say almost everyone that is involved in NatCon, to one degree or another, understands that this restoration of America is it's dependent on Protestant revival and restoration. There's no Catholics and Jews. We can help in all sorts of ways, but without Protestantism, I think it's just not going to happen. And over the last few years, as I've gotten to know young Protestants, many people who are in this room or who've been at these conferences and their friends, and the media that they do, as I get to know them, I see that there's so much passion, there's so much available talent. It's kind of like sort of under wraps, about to explode, but you feel it. You feel that it's there. And on the other hand, there was this initiative some of you might be familiar with, that some of the younger Protestants associated with NatCon, they had this idea, let's do a Protestant NatCon. Let's bring all the Protestants together to focus on the particular issues that Protestants need to deal with in order to be able to step forward as people would like to see. And I won't go into detail, but you're probably familiar with this. My Catholic friends have always said to me, it's never going to happen. Why? Because the Protestants are never going to be able to get their act together. They're never going to agree. And they say, oh, it's just 10,000 different denominations. They'll never be able to create the kind of unified front that you, as a naive Jew, are hoping to see. And I have to say, the last couple of years, I've gotten to see this, sort of dark prophecy. A lot of our young friends spend their time fighting with one another, and I see the hope and the dream of Protestant NatCon. It just kind of recedes. Now I'm hoping for some encouragement to have one of the great Baptist figures and one of the great Reformed figures here together on the stage. But what can you tell us about the possibility of Protestant unity in the face of these extremely hard times
There's the story of the Scots Presbyterian who was washed up on a desert island and was there for years, and he built 2 chapels. And when he was finally rescued, they were asking about, and he said, well, this is where I worship, and this is the chapel I don't go to.
We Jews have that too.
So, basically the answer to this is evangelicals for a long time among themselves, when it comes to soup kitchens or ministries like that, denominations can get together and work together, but the bug in the system has been they do that on the basis of a lowest common denominator approach, and then they say, okay, at a certain point, the lowest common denominator approach turns into liberalism, because how much can we take away from this and still have something going on? And then if someone suggests getting together to do something with Catholics and Jews, a lot of Christians say, wait, we don't want to lose the center of our faith, which is a legitimate concern. And so I would say the thing we have to do is ask and answer hard questions like that. What is the difference between an ally and a co-belligerent? How do we think about our shared goals here theologically? It's not just good enough to say, oh, it's pragmatic, we're just doing it because we want to save our bacon politically. We have to address these things theologically, and that means we have to be grown up enough to have conversations where you don't lose your temper or behave badly. You just have to work through it. These are the things that are non-negotiables for us. How can we navigate this with people who don't share all our fundamental commitments?
I also want to tell you that it's probably on the inside a bit different than it looks on the outside. So I can recognize from the outside it looks like a cacophony of arguments, websites, streaming video, books. I can tell you from the inside, it feels somewhat different. So let me tell you, if I were to talk to one of the young men training for the ministry at the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary, they'd be very much abreast of what Doug is doing. They'd be very much a part of this conversation. And so there's actually a defining, a winnowing, a sorting that is going on. But there's no archbishop to tell us to get in line and behave. There's no magisterium to say there's a meeting tomorrow at 3.
We wouldn't obey if there were.
That's right. And so there's a sense in which, to the outside, it looks very, very confusing. I can tell you from the inside where I am standing, it looks like the issues are becoming more and more defined, and in frankly, a healthy and urgent and perhaps even desperate way than may be visible on the outside. Now, time will tell, but I can tell you that the young people on my campus, and I'm sure this is true of Doug's campus too,
yes,
they're 1,000 times more insightful and insured than and informed and frankly structurally thoughtful than the people who showed up at the National Religious Broadcasters Convention in 1980 and heard Ronald Reagan speak. This is a very different generation. Their concerns are 1,000 leagues deeper, and there's more commonality there than you might think.
Good to hear. Let's take a small practical example and see what we can do with it. You all know that the state of Louisiana a few weeks ago passed a law, the governor signed it, to post the 10 Commandments in every classroom in the state. There's some other things like this going on. There's the state of Texas, the state of Oklahoma are both discussing, introducing Scripture into the public school curriculum. The state of Oklahoma has recently had this initiative to provide state funding for a Catholic school, charter school. Look, it's clear that something is shifting here. Is it possible for for the two of you and maybe everyone here to agree, let's say, that if the state of Louisiana wants to post the 10 Commandments in its schools, that we can support it and say that that's a good thing? Or is that just, too complicated for us to get done right now?
You want a really short answer? It's a good thing. All right, it can't be a bad thing. As a Christian, I cannot but be pleased that the law of God would be made visible, and I think the right word is acknowledged. Now, that does not mean that everything said about it's smart. It doesn't mean that all the arguments for it are well constructed. But the secularist allergy to it proves the point of the basic rightness of it. And so, yeah, bravo, Louisiana. Get some better spokespeople. Right policy.
I would echo that. My fundamental concern is the presence of the kids there, not the presence of the Ten Commandments there. But given the existence of the government schools, given that reality, and given that you can't turn an aircraft carrier around on a dime, I'm entirely in favor of that statement being made. And it goes back to the point I made about flags and flagpoles. Something is going to be there. The schools are there, the kids are there. You're going to have some set of symbols that are there. And because we wouldn't acknowledge the symbolism, of course we want to obey the Ten Commandments, but the symbolic presence of the Ten Commandments is also very important. And so consequently, I'm entirely in favor of that kind of thing. I see also that Tennessee just declared July a month of humiliation and prayer following Pride Month. And asking the Holy Spirit to work on us. So well done, Tennessee. That kind of thing is entirely. How could any good-hearted Christian say no, don't acknowledge God?
Yeah, and the secular version of the Ten Commandments is like a policy of the pronouns put on the classroom wall. And so it's either going to be the pronoun policy of the Ten Commandments in one sense, and let me say, I'm all for the Ten Commandments, unconditionally. Are you going to ask about Christian nationalism?
I think you just answered it. Go ahead, feel free.
No, I think what some people will be interested in is where would Doug and I maybe see things a bit differently in this. And so I think both of us, let me put it this way, I'm a Baptist, and so I think the great issue here is that I can't confuse a saint and a citizen. And so I'm just speaking as a Baptist, a conversionist. And so I have to keep the citizen and the saints categories very clear. But I think what I want to say here is that I want to maximize the Christian commitments of the state, of the civilization. And I would call that acknowledgement. In other words, I'm not claiming that everyone in the state, every citizen is going to be a confessing Christian. I'm going to say that does not mean they're not obligated to the acknowledgement of the Christian structure of this civilization and its commitments. And again, I go back to the fact, in revealed truth. And so this is where I think one of the most interesting common ground areas exists. But I think this is where, as you think about the future of Christian approaches to these questions, on the same side politically, there are going to be some people who are going to say, on these definitional issues, there's still some good work to be done. And I'm very glad to be here with Doug. And I think you can see the vast agreement on all the big questions. But some of the issues that are germane to the policies, even to be put into place, have to do with the relationship between the church and the state and the citizen and the saint.
I would maybe surprise everybody by agreeing with 90% of that. The Paedo-Baptists who settled in New England had this was one of the first presenting problems that they had, the citizenship, the membership in the church and citizen voting privileges and so on. And they didn't exactly cover themselves with glory when they came up with what they called the halfway covenant, because it's a thorny, difficult problem. How do you have a Christian consensus that is the basis for your laws, the common law, the structure of government, and where does that leave the non-believer, or where does that leave the nominal Christian believer? Where does that leave the Presbyterian church versus the Baptist church versus the Methodist? What do you do there? I'm very comfortable with what the American Westminster Confession of Faith settled on, which was I'm opposed to establishment of religion. At the state level, I don't think it's unconstitutional, but I think it's a bad idea at the state level also. So when the Constitution was ratified, 9 of the 13 states had formal relationships with Christian denominations, which I think is not a good idea. I think the relationship ought to be informal so that we avoid this citizen-saint dilemma, and that has to be brokered and worked out. The other thing is, as we return to a Protestant Christian consensus in America, as we pray for that, there's no way to look at the history of the United States and strive for that without including the Baptists. Right? The Baptists were the second generation. The first generation of the colonists were Congregationalists, Presbyterians, Anglicans. But by the second generation, it was overwhelmingly Baptistic. And so that theology is woven into our civic DNA, and that has to be honored subject to the Word of God. So, and that means theological summits, books, interactions, conferences, working this out. It's a hard question, because you don't want to, on the other hand, say your citizenship has nothing to do with this revealed truth, but okay, how close do you have to get?
And I think that just one other thing is that this demonstrates why these conversations are very different when undertaken as today between a Baptist and a Presbyterian who hold to an Augustinian Reformed theological structure and tradition. And so that means there would be Protestants who would, I think, not connect to some of these issues so readily, which means we have to persuade them.
And I'm a Presbyterian, not a Lesbiterian.
All right. We are technically out of time, but I want to do just one extra inning because of where we just got in the conversation. So if I heard correctly, both of you agree with Dr. Mohler's phrasing that a Christian should be committed to maximizing the Christian commitments of the state. Right, so having said that, when you think of this coming state where the Christian commitments are maximized, is there room for Jews or fellow Bible believers? Is there room for Muslims, Hindus? How do you approach thinking about a maximally Christian committed state in a world in which the partners for getting there, quite a few of them are not going to be Christians?
I would say briefly that Jews in this ideal republic that I would envision, or that we'd hammer out, Jews would be more welcome than they currently are here.
Yeah, I would say enthusiastically so. And so, for instance, among my tribe, so to speak, theologically, it would be seen as a matter of absolute divine responsibility to be fully respectful of the Jewish people, fully protective, and have the Jewish people fully integrated in the entire project. And I think this is where also, quite honestly, where you have, traditional Roman Catholics, conservative Protestants, and conservative Jewish people who basically already live in the same world and acknowledge that and have a mutual dependence and appreciation. I think when you asked the question, though, you broadened it and you said Hindus and Muslims and others. I don't think a nation can survive without theological commitments. That does not mean it cannot allow others to be a part of the community and even invite others in a certain sense into the community, but it does mean that there has to be the explicit acknowledgement that this is a nation with specific theological accountability and theological commitments. Those coming should respect that, must respect that, understand that. And so the kind of modern secularist dream is, I believe, a constitutional nightmare.
I agree with all of that.
Okay, so it's time to close the session. I would like to, maybe it's a little bit out of line, but if you're willing to invite a handshake between the two of you. Thank
Push in the envelope.
Thank you for a wonderful session.
Ladies and gentlemen, there'll be a 15-minute break before our breakout sessions begin. 15 minutes to get coffee. Thank you.